Have you tried spotlight colouring? In this video, I show you how. Hello there, Michelle Short here with Terrific Tags with Michelle. I'm here on the Altenew YouTube channel on the first and third Saturday of the month. So if you enjoy my videos, I'd love for you to subscribe. So let's get started. Since it's National Colouring Book Day, I'm using the Botanical Elegance watercolour colouring book. There are lots of images in this book. They are printed onto watercolour paper, but there is another book that is cardstock if you wanted to use like pencils or markers or anything like that. Today I'm doing watercolouring, so that's why I'm using the watercolouring book. I'm kind of making this as a bit of a shortcut because you could absolutely do this with a stamped image, but since I've got this book full of lots of lovely images, I may as well utilise it and not have to go through the process of stamping out my image. So I've picked the one I like, and I think this is Cosmos. I'm not 100% certain, but I think it's Cosmos. I do want to cut this down into an A2 size panel because that's what's going to be my finished card size. So I've got a template here that's cut from some plastic, and I'm using that to guide where I want to cut this down. So I'm just grabbing my pencil there and making some marks where the corners are going to be, and I've taken that to my guillotine and cut that down. I'm now grabbing the half-tone circles nesting die set, and I'm using this to create my spotlights for my spotlight colouring. I'm literally creating spotlights here with the circles, but you could do this in lots of different shapes. You could maybe create a rectangle in the centre and have the outside edges be without colour, or you could kind of cut a shape in the center and have that color be with color and then the outside be without. I quite like doing the circles because it means that I can have different areas that are colored in on this panel and not just have one area colored in, but it's definitely personal preference. So I've placed these circles down onto my panel. I'm holding them down with some low tack tape, and then I can run those through my die cutting machine. I do want to keep the circles and the background, so I'm just being careful here to remove those carefully from that background piece. I then want to cut some circles from watercolour paper, and I'm going to cut these multiple times so that I can layer them up one on top of each other to create some dimension behind the ones that I'm going to colour in. You could do this with foam tape instead of adding lots of layers of cardstock, but I thought it would just look a little bit neater with the layers of cardstock. And I did watercolour paper here just so that the papers match in terms of colour. I'm then going to bring in the dual tip pens to colour in my images. So I'm starting off with the Tahitian Terrace set, and I want to grab some pinks from these sets and also some yellows for the centres and then green for the leaves. This is the Islands of Fiji set, and then I've got the Zanzibar set there at the bottom. And then I can grab that last light pink. I've got the petal palette, and then also some water and some fine watercolour brushes. I'm using a size 4 and a size 2 today. I'm going to grab the lightest shade of pink, which is baby pink, and I'm going to scribble that down onto my palette. I can then wet my brush with some water and then bring that to that pen that I've scribbled on top, and it's going to create kind of like a watercolour. You can use these pens as is, but since they are water based, I thought I would use them as a watercolouring medium today. So I'm going in onto my image here, and I'm trying to focus most of the darker colour towards the sort of centre or the base of these petals, and then I'm going to lighten it up as I go towards the tip of the petals. I'm starting off with a kind of wet on dry technique. As I go along, I switch and go to wet on wet, and you'll see why in a little while. So I'm starting off kind of like a base layer of this light pink. Now ordinarily when kind of watercoloring images like this, you would really want to kind of leave a petal in between in case the colours sort of mix together. Since I'm going in with such light colours at this point in time, it doesn't really matter too much, but as I go onto the image I do tend to skip ones. I'm not using a huge amount of water here, so it is drying quite quickly, but I don't really want them to kind of blend into each other, especially if I've got lighter areas and darker areas. So I've gone in with the base layer of those two petals there, and now I'm bringing in fuchsia, which is just a little bit darker, and it's a little bit more of a vibrant pink as well. I can mix that with some water, and then I can bring that to my image here. So I'm going to again focus that darker colour towards the base of the petal, and then I'm also kind of bringing it in this petal to the left hand side as well. I just thought that it would be a little bit darker there, kind of nestled behind the other petals. So I can go in where I think the area is going to be darkest, and then I can wet my brush and blend that out. And it is easier to blend wet on wet, which is why I kind of moved to that technique a little bit later. As for now, I'm going in, and because the base layer of the lighter pink is almost dry at this point, they're not blending that well, so it is taking me a little while to try and sort of blend those colours out a little bit. I don't want the whole petal being this darker shade. So you can see here that I go back into my water and then try and blend that out a little bit there on the right hand side. And then I did want a little bit of extra darkness there, so I go back in adding a little bit more colour. And this time I'm going to go in with a wet on wet technique. So I have wetted the entire area of that petal, and now I can bring in this lighter shade of pink, and it's going to blend out so much better. Sometimes it depends on the medium how well the colours will blend. These aren't watercolors, like they're not tube watercolors, so they do take a little bit more effort to blend out than say a watercolor tube, but I do really like using them. I do find that these kind of dye pigments do produce kind of like a brighter image, which is quite nice, like a little bit more vibrancy to them. So here you can see, like I said, I'm missing out some of the petals and then going in with which ones that I think will be a bit drier. So I did kind of go petal to petal at this point, but you could go over the whole area if you wanted to, kind of like in one layer of the light pink and then go in with the dark pink. I'm just figuring out there which areas I need to leave to be green. I didn't want to accidentally go over where it was supposed to be the green leaves. It is a little bit difficult to see, obviously, because I've cut this out into this shape, but it's really helpful because in that watercolouring book you've got one kind of image that is got dark black outlines, which is what I'm using today, and then you've got another one with a kind of slightly lighter grey outline, and so I've still got that one that I can use for reference, which is really helpful. Otherwise I could just pop this circle back into the background and then I'd be able to see a little bit easier where the areas are that are supposed to be the foliage. So I got a little bit too much water there onto that petal, so I'm just dabbing that off with a cloth, and then I can go in again with that colour. So I'm just going to finish off colouring in all of those petals, and then I can go in with a slightly darker shade, which is Rubellite. I'm going to start off, because the area is all dry at this point, I'm going to start off with quite a wet mixture. I'm going to add it over the top again where I want that darkness to be, and this isn't a huge amount darker than what's already there. I am going to blend that out with some clean water, and then I'm going to scribble some more of that marker down and then pick that up with that wet brush. and that's going to make that quite a lot darker. But because my base layer was already dry, I wanted to make sure that I could then go in with the wet on wet technique again, just because these can be very vibrant, and so it's a little bit harder to blend them out. So that worked quite well, this technique, for me. And then again, I can just try and blend that out. And then I can just do the same thing for the rest of this circle here. Just trying to add the darker colours kind of like into those nooks and crannies where it would be darkest naturally. So I've gone in and done all of the petals on these pieces, and now I can colour in this flower centre, and I'm using Fresh Lemon and Snapdragon. So I've switched to a size 2 brush here, and I'm going in first with a layer of the Fresh Lemon. Some of the pink did overlap this flower centre a little bit, so I'm going to try and add the darker colour with that Snapdragon in those places where it has overlapped a little bit, and it's just going to kind of create a little bit more shadow. So I can now go in with that Snapdragon, and I want it to be darker sort of towards the base of this flower centre, and then kind of around the outside edges. And then I can mix the two together as well if I want a slightly lighter shade, or kind of a middle shade, I suppose. And then for the foliage, I'm using Bamboo, Grass Field, and then I realised at this point that that's a little bit lighter than I expected. Once I do add the water to it, it does darken up a little bit, but I did bring in Emerald, which is a little bit more of like a teal kind of green, and just to make some areas a little bit darker. So I've gone in with that water to start with, and now I can go in with Bamboo, and I want to try and make some of these areas a little bit lighter and some of them a little bit darker. I didn't want it to be all one flat colour. And again, I'm using that size 2 brush just because those areas are quite small. I can then kind of mix the emerald and the grass field together, and then I do scribble a little bit more of that grass field down to see if I can get a little bit more from that colour. So just trying to create a little bit of interest here with the 3 different shades of green. Because there's not a huge amount of colour on this finished card, obviously it's just in these 3 circles, I wanted to try and make them kind of as vibrant as possible. So I can just finish off with a little bit more of that emerald. And then I can fill in these tiny little gaps here where they're supposed to be green, where the stem is of the flower, and then also there's a little bit of kind of a leaf poking through as well. And then I can set those aside to dry. I've then got my background piece. I'm adding some glue tape onto the back of that, making sure to add quite a lot of that. Want to make sure that this sticks down really nicely. And then because there are a few areas that I couldn't quite get to with that glue tape, I'm going in with some liquid glue just to make sure that everything's going to be stuck down nicely. And then it also gives me a little bit of time to wiggle it in place and try and line it up perfectly on this A2 size card base. So that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. If the panel is a little bit smaller than the outside or a little bit larger, I can take it to my guillotine and cut the edges down, but thankfully it pretty much fitted quite nicely. So just pressing that down, making sure that that's well stuck down. And then I can bring in my circle pieces, and like I say, this is just going to add a little bit of dimension to the circles, just so that I'm not sticking them back down in completely flat. For this small circle here, I can adhere them all one on top of each other and then add that into the opening. So adding some liquid glue there, and then I can pop that down. And just making sure that that's in perfectly. And then for these other two ones, I do want to add them one at a time, because I want to cut off the excess from the side, and it's a little bit easier to cut one layer of cardstock at a time rather than trying to cut 3 layers of watercolour paper. So I'm just trying to line that up as best as possible, making sure that that's well stuck down, and then I can flip that over and use the edge of my card base here to where I want to cut with my scissors. And I didn't cut that quite perfectly, so I'm just going to go back in and cut that little piece off. And then I can do the exact same thing and add another layer on top. And I'm going to do 3 layers for each of the circles. Lay that on top and then cut off the excess. I can then add some liquid glue onto the back of the pieces that I added the watercolouring on. So I'm placing that down to start with, and then I do lean right over here to try and make sure that I'm lining up those lines of the image. So this is kind of a bit like spotlight colouring as well as the eclipse technique, because you are kind of popping that up and then popping it back on top. So it's a little bit of both techniques, which is quite good. This one was a little bit easier for me to line up because I've got that edge of the card there. But I'm using that liquid glue, so I've got time to wiggle it in place. And then for this circle here at the bottom, I thought it'd be quite fun to make it into a tag. So I'm just trying to make sure that that's lined up, and then I can bring in my pencil and just make a little mark there towards the top where I want to punch a hole with my handheld punch. So I can just punch a hole there, just to remove any excess pencil marks with an eraser. And then I realised as I was going to pop this on top that you would see through that hole there, and I wanted to just add a little bit of pink. So I'm bringing back my palette and just adding a little bit of that colour there behind, just so that it's not kind of poking through as white. It didn't end up being the exact right tone, but it is, I think, still better being pink than white. I can then thread some twine through the top of this now, which is a tag, and tie that in a bow. So I'm just going to fiddle with that bow for a little while, trying to get it the size that I want. I can then add some more liquid glue onto the back of this piece. And then line that up with the image on the card. And again, this one was a little bit easier because I've got that straight line there at the bottom. And then I realised at this point that I didn't want the bow to be quite as big as I had made it. So I'm just making that a little bit smaller and then cutting those tails down with some scissors. I have then stamped and heat embossed a sentiment from the Sentiment Strips 3 stamp set. And I want to add a little bit of dimension onto this, but I didn't want to add it with foam tape because I've already got quite a lot of layers of cardstock. So I'm going to cut a piece of Crafty Necessities Jet Black cardstock, which is what I used for the sentiment itself. And I can just add a layer of that onto the back. I'm just adhering that down with a little bit of liquid glue. And that's just going to mean that it's popped up a little bit, but it's not kind of two-dimensional. And then I can add some more liquid glue onto the back of that and adhere that down onto the card. And I'm just going to bring in my T-square ruler just to try and line that up perfectly. And I just needed to wiggle that a little bit to make that straight. And then to finish off, I'm going to add some clear iridescent stellar sequins, just to add a little bit of sparkle onto the card and a little bit more added interest. So I'm just adding small dabs of glue onto my images here. And then I can pick up those sequins with my perfect picker and pop those in place. And I'm just using a few different sizes here. And that is the card finished for today. I really love having those spotlights of the colouring and then the rest of it be left blank. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on the Altenew blog. Thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Wait, we have more where that came from. If you're after fabulous card making tutorials, you are definitely in the right spot. Our amazing design team create and upload fabulous video tutorials right to this YouTube channel. If you don't want to miss another amazing crafting tutorial, don't forget to subscribe and click that fun red button that you can see. Let's become paper crafting experts together.